Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janda for CardRunners, and I'm here with the theory behind advanced bet sizing, part 3. So we have a few goals for this video. The first is to talk about the river bet sizing formula. I'm going to mention where it comes from, what its limitations are, and how useful it is. Then we're going to go over tons of bet sizing examples. We're going to discuss when to overbet the river, when to bet pretty small, and the difference between in-position and out-of-position bets. So I've mentioned before in the past that it's really important to understand when to bet big, because the difference in EV between betting like half pot and 1.5 pot size bets can be huge. Whereas if you're not that good at betting small, which is typically harder to do, it's not usually as important because the EV between, betting 0.5 pot size bets and betting 0.35 pot size bets isn't going to be that big a deal. So we're especially going to focus on the overbet aspect because that's more important. The one other thing I want to mention before we jump into this video is we're not going to discuss in detail like why a lot of people get confused about what a value bet is and how on the river, especially when you're out of position, you can bet a hand, for value expecting to lose when called. That stuff's discussed a lot in other places, especially in the 2+2 book I wrote, Applications of No Limit Hold'em. So just know we're not going to be discussing that stuff here. We're really going to focus on bet sizing when we are betting in this video, not over a lot of the things people can get confused with what the term value bet means on the river. Where to find the formula? So first you can check out pages 154 to 155 in Mathematics of Poker by Bill Chen and Jared Ankenman to see how this formula is derived. I hope I didn't mispronounce his last name. This book was way ahead of its time, and this formula wasn't discussed nearly enough. So this, in my opinion, is one of the most useful pieces of information from the book Mathematics of Poker. And it's something that you just didn't really see discussed very much, even though it's been around for a long time. Really, really good players have known about it, but it's just not something that's widely discussed because it's a little hard to implement, and because, Mathematics of Poker was just so ahead of its time, a lot of times the really advanced stuff got ignored. In Applications of No Limit Hold'em, I derived a similar, though it's pretty much the same formula in a slightly different way. This formula I think is a little bit easier for me to use, and it's one I feel more comfortable talking about. So that's the formula we're going to use here, and that's in pages 339 to 346 of the book, and that will explain exactly where it comes from. So this is the formula. 0 equals 1 minus 2y times 1 plus 2x plus x squared, where x is our bet size in terms of pot size bets, and y is how often we effectively lose. And the term effectively lose is very important here. We're not going to discuss how to derive the formula, but it's important to know its limitations. And we also are going to discuss in detail what effectively lose means. So what does it mean to effectively lose? We effectively lose in one of two ways. We bet and are called and lose, or we bet and our opponent raises with a balanced range, which turns our hand into a bluff catcher. In this situation, calling and folding both have an EV of 0, so we have effectively lost. Imagine we always fold when facing a raise, since both calling and folding have 0 EV and folding is lower raise. Okay, so all this means is, let's imagine you're betting the river and you're out of position. If you bet the river and your opponent calls, you just lost your bet and you lost the pot. That's easy enough. Everyone's used to that happening. But if you're bet folding on the river, which is something that's very common to do with a value betting hand on the river, right? When you're betting on the river, most of your betting range needs to be value hands. So if your opponent raises, you have to fold a lot of your value bets in order for everything to theoretically make sense. If you're not folding some value hands on the river, your opponent's never going to bluff. He would just call. So when you bet that river and your opponent raises, if your opponent's balanced, you're almost always, or I shouldn't say almost always, the vast majority of your value betting range will then become a bluff catcher because your opponent will be raising with a very polarized range of like nut type hands in air. And then both the EV of calling and the EV of folding are both 0 if your opponent's balanced. So you effectively lost when that happens, since you bet, you faced a raise, and you don't care if you call, you don't care if you fold, you have 0 EV either way. So it's best to just assume you were bet folding because that makes it a little bit easier to visualize. So when you're bet folding hand on the river, you lose in one of two ways. Number 1 is you face a raise. Number 2 is you call and lose.